Alright, we have 3 new ones this week. The 2 wide releases and then an indie thing, but obviously, of course, we're going to start with the wide releases, and I think we're going to go ahead and start with Old, which, of course, is that time that comes along every now and then where we have to question, and I'm sure he enjoys making us question, do we love M. Night Shyamalan, or do we hate him, or are we somewhere in the middle? Are we just totally, completely still undecided whether he is talented or not? And this is probably, of all the other things he's done, probably one of the more prime examples of he seems to very much be both in one sense or the other, where there's, much like many of his movies, there's so many things that are interesting about this, whether it be the ideas that it has, or the way it's shot, or some of the choices he makes, or whatever. And then there's some really fucking bad ideas in it too, and some really terrible executions, and some terrible ideas. This one, while most of his stuff is like kind of original to varying degrees, he even has like an intro if you see it in the theater, where he talks about how much of a joy it is to bring, like, his original stories and his original ideas to the screen. It's really funny he says that for this one, considering this one's based on a graphic novel. Uh, but still, to my understanding, it's faithful for a lot of it, and then the M. Night ideas start coming in. And I think even not having laid eyes on this graphic novel, I feel like I can tell what's probably his specifically, and where this original story is coming from. But yeah, but it does still kind of fit him and fit his style in the sense that he's one of those cases where it's particularly that one camera move, where it can just kind of go from one side to the other, where you can just identify him immediately. There was so much of that in like Signs specifically, I remember, and you can tell that it's him for sure in both the style and the varying degrees of, is this good or not, or is it at least effective? Because we do have a very interesting concept, and I'm not really sure, because I'm somebody that tries to avoid trailers. I'm not entirely sure how much is known by most people going into this, and what is kind of being hidden about the story. I really have no idea. Um, but the basic concept, obviously, being that this beach that Gallagher Garcia Bernal and his family, and Rufus Sewell and his family, and a few other people are on, that makes them age rapidly. And I believe the math is that if they were to spend an entire day on the beach, it would be about the equivalent of 50 years. I think it's what we're led to believe. So that's obviously got a lot of horrifying connotations to it when you look at like the idea of having to accept the inevitability of aging and death, and sort of almost embrace it in a way if you're going to try not to completely fear it. But obviously, with the concept, this leads the way to have that as an underlying thing, like have this sort of almost sadness to it, and this sort of existential fear in it, while also being like a full-on body horror kind of thing. So there's a lot going into this that really, really works on paper, and he's able to make, like I said, particularly the way it's shot, where it's this really interesting case where this could be, and some people might criticize it for this, but I think it's certainly interesting in the particular way, because you can imagine this in, like, saying, like trying to dance around a rating, where not much is actually shown on camera. Like a lot of the happenings here aren't on screen. It's mostly just reaction shots, or kind of somewhat giving us a slight vibe of what it is, but not really showing us anything full on. And that's what most of the events of this movie are, and how they play out, where we don't really see much of anything. And I can see that really pissing people off. And like I said, making it feel, it could almost be distracting because you can actually almost feel them dancing around. Oh, we don't want to get past our PG-13 or anything. Um, but I do think there's a certain effect to that, and it seems like there's this fluctuation in popularity in regards to what audiences want. Where after a while, if you give them a bunch of gore or whatever, and you're showing everything on screen, it becomes popular to say, "Oh, it's so much more effective when you don't show it." But then, if we get a long line of stuff that doesn't show it, everybody's like, "Oh no, we want to see everything. Like, why are we even here if you're not going to show us anything?" And it just goes back and forth, and people will complain about it one way or the other. And here, it is much like the rest of the movie, and his approach to it. It's all very conflicting, because in a sense, I do like the idea of us not really seeing much of it and our mind kind of getting to come up with ourselves. There's one particular case involving a fully decomposed body, and the only way we look at it, which was relief to me because I can't do bones very well. It's just something that really gets to me for some reason. But the way they show this completely decomposed body is what appears to be, I can't quite confirm this, but it appears to be we're looking out at the characters through an intense close up of a rib cage, maybe, where there's we're just looking through thick black lines, I guess you could say. And I'm getting the sense it's like a rib cage or something we're looking through at them, and that's the only real look we get at this decomposed body. So it's like literally right in your face, but then also you can't see it at all. And there's something really interesting about that and showing something horrific in that kind of way, especially if it's letting your imagination sort of take over. But at the same time, there is a certain appeal to like that sort of body horror subgenre where it's like you want to see what creative things they can do with like practical gore effects and stuff like that. Um, but so obviously that's not gonna really be here too much. Um, and a lot of the stuff we do see doesn't look all that practical. It does look particularly CGI, I guess. Um, but it's also still a way to kind of show off how Shaw has been so good over the years with really small budgets and being able to play that. And how sometimes you have movies that like it's almost like he's at a point in his career now where it's almost like the budgets are like by choice. Whereas when you hear about a lot of stuff in regards to the camera not showing too much, it's typically because it's like when they're practically on an indie budget and they have no choice but to not show anything and they just use that to their advantage. But to basically do that as a choice when you could probably be given any amount of money, I mean, regardless of the reception many of his movies have received, it still feels like he's in a position to where he could probably get a really decently sized budget if he were to ask for it. But the fact that he seems to be choosing to keep it low, it shows that he's willing to do really interesting things to kind of not just rely on being able to do big things for the sake of being big, and to kind of sticking to these small roots with these small budgets. Whether we're getting a worthwhile product out of it remains to be seen. But I can really appreciate the approach like that, just on that level alone. So that's just one of the few things where it's like I can really admire what he does, and there's like at the same time while I was like I was saying, the whole watching the whole movie is so conflicting. Like the feelings are just constantly battling each other within you, because it's like on one hand, I felt like it felt kind of dragged out, and I kind of felt like we would kind of kept waiting for things to happen, and there were a lot of boring stretches. But at the same time, I also remember feeling frequently, "Holy shit, this is really wild." But like there's such a balance of those two completely different things that it's almost like my mind kind of balanced, and I just feel indifferent to the movie. Like they were almost outweighing each other. Like it wasn't necessarily like, oh, how wild these parts are makes me forget how boring these parts were, or the other way around. It's just kind of we're just kind of stuck in this neutral place through the whole time, and there's a lot of stuff in there that's the stuff that Sean rightfully has been criticized for in the past. Particularly, I've talked about how he can have really great ideas, and he's a really strong director. Um, Even if you don't always get that vibe, he definitely has a certain unique and interesting eye when it comes to his movies and the way they look. Um, it's the writing that it's like it almost like I almost didn't even want to bring it up because it's almost such a cliche at this point to say that he's not a great writer, and his characters say really weird shit all the time, no matter whether it's one of his really bad movies or one of his really good movies. Characters are always saying weird, unnatural shit in his movies to the point that it's like a trademark. So I almost felt like, is it even like how much can you even fault it at this point? Because it's almost like, is it the movie itself that has really bad dialogue, or is that just literally it's a Shyamalan movie. That's exactly what it is. Like it's and it, like to the point that you almost have to expect, like is he doing it on purpose now is my question, I think. Not that that would excuse it necessarily, but it does have. It's kind of exciting to have those questions. Like it's certainly exciting when he puts a movie out because you just have no idea going in how you're gonna feel about it, which is something I can get behind. Um, but there is the writing in particular is a pretty big hindrance to this in retrospect. So, and while it's happening, but particularly in retrospect as well. Um, where it's a lot of, like, especially when he's writing kids, they get especially weird dialogue. But that's the thing, is it's almost like, when he was doing Hedwig and Split and Glass, it's almost like he was kind of having fun with the fact that he always writes weird dialogue for kids. Like, it's almost like Hedwig was basically him calling himself out, is almost what it felt like. But, yeah, but still there's going to be a shitload of exposition, especially for something like this. Something like this that should probably be more ambiguous is going to have a lot of exposition, which is going to bring it down. Um, there's a lot of stuff where people just continuously explain who they are. There's even a point in time, talking about the weird dialogue with kids, where they're like running around at the beginning where he's made a new friend, and they're running around and they're just going around asking people their names and occupations, and that's what they're doing with their day for fun. And it's like it's just all these things where it can typically be fun if there's like a setup to something and then a big payoff for it later. But especially in his writing, not exactly the same effect when you can see scenes are happening, and you can see from a mile away these scenes are only happening for the sake of being a payoff later. To the point that that's so, like, it's so blatant. Like, there's no other reason there would be a scene of the game that the kids play as, hey, let's walk up to random strangers and ask them their names and occupations. And then Garcia Bernal's wife, who is played by Vicky Cruz from Phantom Thread, it keeps mentioning a lot that she's like a museum curator. And there's a point in time where she's getting into it, but I think it might have been Rufus Sewell. There was a lot of tension with his character, and she says something along the lines of, "Don't worry, I'm a museum curator. You can trust me." Like it's like I guess she was trying to say something about like her judgment wouldn't be biased or something. I don't know. I really don't know. It's that Shyamalan dialogue that, like I said, you just kind of have to expect at this point, to the point that it's almost like he's making it a trademark on purpose. I don't know, but even with that in mind, like even if you were to run with that, it's kind of particularly egregious here to the point that it can't necessarily be overlooked. It sticks out kind of in a bad way through the whole thing, and kind of feels like it's being weird for the sake of being weird. But I also can't tell if that's on purpose or not, and not always in the fun way. So it's yeah. And as far as like horror cliches, we've got stuff like spontaneous nosebleeds, which is one of the ultimate check boxes for a horror movie, especially one that seems to not have too much of an idea of where it's going for a while. In this particular case, there does end up being a purpose for the nosebleeds that makes sense, but I still kind of immediately just associate spontaneous nosebleed with lazy horror movie because it's just like a go-to image. But no, whatever. It does have some things up its sleeve. I did find when I was talking about the tensions with River Soul, I do think he's an interesting character, pretty much just based on the fact that he's relatively unpredictable as a character. Like we're never quite sure if he's what exactly is going on in his head from point A to B or even C. Whether he's going to be a normal, if possibly aggressive, potentially racist kind of guy, or if he's going to be violent and deadly, or if he's going to be really almost like he's just lost entirely. Like there's a point there's a kind of a running joke throughout the movie. Because Shyamalan's always kind of trying to sprinkle in like that sort of dark humor or whatever. Or characters saying the weirdest, most random shit at the most inopportune time they possibly could be. And there's a running joke where Rufus's character is trying to remember the Missouri breaks. He's talking about like the hey, Brando and Nicholson did a movie together, but what was the title of it? I can't remember. And he does this in like the most inappropriate situations, in the most like life-threatening situations, and like, it's almost that unpredictability of his character is very interesting, and kind of adds this certain bizarre quality to the movie. And honestly, that's the kind of stuff where I was saying in a positive way, like, well, this is really weird, but I kind of like it for that. When you just had no idea what a character was going to do or say in a circumstance of they really shouldn't be doing that right now. Like if it has such a surreal quality to it, and that's kind of when I was into it. Like I said, there's only so many ways you can do that before it's like it it's not working as well. It doesn't have the effect, and it can feel kind of forced a little bit, but yeah, but throughout it, of course, there is this sort of air of mystery that kind of does keep pulling you back, and even in its sort of dull stretches. But once again, sometimes that's just in the way it's shot or the way it feels, and the score is doing some work here also. Like there is a rapper who calls himself Mid-Sized Sedan, and he's the first shot we get of him is very interesting because we're not entirely sure until later where exactly he and this girl are that he's with, or what they're doing here, or how they got here, or who they even are at this point. There's just this one quick scene with no dialogue that introduces them, and there's just something kind of so eerie about it, just in its feel alone. And stuff like that I was into. The stuff where you're not quite sure what exactly is happening, and nobody's trying to really explain anything to you. You're just kind of watching some shit that feels off. Like nothing particularly off is happening, but the whole thing just has a feel that something isn't right. Um, and that's something that he does really well when he can pull it off. But there's also a lot of confusing things about the setup, like in regards to when the kids start aging, do they keep the mentality of their age they started at? That seems to kind of fluctuate when need be, so that was kind of hard to figure out. Um, and then there was those moments, those very Shyamalan moments where it's like he's able to balance the intensity of a scene and the absurdity of a scene, and it's like it works in both ways. The more absurd a scene gets, the tension's kind of continuously rising also, or the other way, where it's like if a scene starts to really build in tension, there'll be something really fucking absurd happening on the side that's building right along with it at the same like tempo, and it's really bizarre. So I really have no idea um, how to take this movie, quite honestly. So, like, I almost like I mean I would say overall it's not something I would recommend, but a part of me also there's that part of me that was like really into like some of the more wild shit. Like I said, maybe the kind of stuff that puts people off. But that's just the way his movies work. Is they're just so bizarre and so kind of their own thing, which is admirable in its own right. Really, um, it just depends on like it's not really something you can say. Oh, you should see this, or oh, you shouldn't. It just really depends on the person, or even probably the mood. Um, like I kind of want to watch this movie in a different mood and see if that even how much that changes it, if at all. But it's a whole baffling kind of experience, and that's kind of I said maybe that's what you go into his movies for. I don't know. There's also the whole thing of never quite knowing for sure what's supposed to be funny and what isn't. Um, there was a really great balance of that in The Visit, especially where the Visit is basically a full on comedy that just kind of happens to be horror also. um, there is a moment that you could put under the body horror label, and it's in another context it could be a really sort of terrifying moment or a terrifying scene or whatever, but a few rows down from me there's one particular shot of two characters together, and there was a woman a few rows down from me that was cackling like the Wicked Witch loud. And in an interesting way, that woman's reaction felt appropriate without necessarily being a point against Shyamalan, if that makes sense. Like it's like the way he finds that balance of this is supposed to be really weird and potentially horrifying, but it's also hilarious in a very outward way as well. It could also be uncomfortable after all. So like the lead into that is really fucking weird, and off, but the whole movie is really fucking weird and off. So I don't know, but like at the end of the day, it does have that underlying thing of just especially I feel like I've talked so many times now about the whole idea of being just afraid of time in general and how quickly it's passing, how quickly it's like we all feel like we're relatively young now, but it's like in the blink of an eye we're literally going to be old and dead if we make it that far. uh, and it's and this movie literally explores that, and but they do have some like genuinely sad moments where they go into that, but they don't really. I say they don't go into it enough, but at the same time, I guess given the movie's concept, it would be hard because the time is moving so quickly anyway. It's kind of hard to go into that more in depth, with what the concept has given us, has the way it's been set up, but there's still enough of the existential stuff here that something like you'll leave with something, which is probably more than you can say about a lot of movies that have come out lately, that you can at least walk out of it with like something that carries over and something you'll still think about. And in a movie this absurd, that's a pretty big accomplishment if it gets you to like really think about something that does kind of genuinely scare the shit out of you, like long after it's over. Like I said, if you're like me, those fears are always there anyway. This movie just might enhance them for a little bit. So there is that. And then lastly, I doubt I'm saying too much. If you know you've watched a video this far about a Shyamalan movie, and I mentioned that there's a twist in it, and you think that's a spoiler, you're probably a fucking idiot. I'm sorry, but yeah, there's a twist in it, and I honestly don't mind the twist. I think I've heard some vague things about some people are unhappy about the twist and they think it's unnecessary and all that, and I can get that too. But I don't mind what the twist is. What I do mind is that it should have stopped at the twist reveal, but it goes on a little bit more to kind of wrap it up a little more, and that's what I don't think is necessary. I don't mind the twist, honestly, but definitely probably should have stopped there, if not before. Like it would have done just fine without a twist, quite honestly. And there's a pretty decent, cutoff point where it could have ended in a big way. There's actually a few times where it looks like we're getting an ending shot and it's not. But it's yeah, I would have cut it off earlier, but I know some people would cut it off even earlier than that, and I can see both of those. But the last 5 minutes or so really doesn't need to be there. So, and if anything, it's kind of the when you really think about that last 5 minutes or so, I don't think you're gonna walk away with the feeling that's intended. So that's probably its biggest problem. So yeah, like I'm really dancing here on what's saying too much and what isn't. So I guess I can just stop there. So yeah. So I mean, I don't really recommend. Like, I'll probably remember this being more, dull than I will the really crazy shit and the feelings that those surreal scenes really brought out. But those in the moment, those more surreal and absurd scenes are pretty insane, and feel like they might make it worthwhile. But there's like just enough to balance it out where there's pretty much just as much that's not worthwhile than it is the stuff that's makes you say holy shit. So yeah, so it's pretty much just right there in the middle. And like I said, I guess it's getting to a point now where I pretty much show up to Shyamalan movies in, imagining I'm gonna be very indifferent and really, really like stuff and really, really not like stuff. Like when I rewatched Glass, I think that was just last month. And I still don't fucking know how I really feel about it. Because there's so many great ideas in it and so much stuff I do like and so many directions it's starting to go that I like. And then it's just so, like, it's amazing how much somebody can shit the bed in their own premise. But he always finds a way. So, yeah. So, but if you're used to that, you might get a little more out of this. Or if the weird and crazy shit stands out to you more than the dull stretches, then by all means, look into this. But yeah, I don't know. He's such a mystery to me, which I think is a large part of his appeal. So I'm just forever conflicted when it comes to M. Night Shyamalan, apparently. So with all that said, and all those circles we've been running in, let's go into the second movie, which is Snake Eyes, which is a G.I. Joe origin or something. There's some kind of subtitle that they're not really sticking with, but it's a prequel-esque thing to the whole G.I. Joe thing. I don't know if they're trying to restart something, or if this is directly related to the other two movies that have come out in the last 10 years or so. The 2009 movie, and then I think 2013 was when Retaliation came out. I remember so little about Retaliation, as I'm sure most people don't remember anything about it. But yeah, but obviously we're getting a standalone movie for Snake Eyes, which I should probably just go ahead and say right now. Pretty much everything I'm about to say comes from having hardly any connection to this whatsoever. Like, I had some G.I. Joe action figures growing up, and I saw those last two movies. That's about it. I think there's comics. I think there was an animated series. that's all I really know going into this. I don't really know what the character is supposed to be, or what people are expecting of him going into this. No idea whatsoever. I don't even really remember him in those other two, because I don't really remember those other two movies, apart from Joseph Gordon-Levitt going all in in the first one. That's pretty much all I take away from either one of those. So yeah, that's how I go into this, with like no expectations whatsoever. Like, I had no idea. I didn't know what the story was. I don't know that much about the character or what he's supposed to be. I went into this with no expectations whatsoever. Like, none at all. So, and hoping there would be some good action is basically what I went into it with. That's about it. So at the start of it, much like what Shyamalan did for Old, Henry Golding has given us a bit of an introduction to thank us for coming to theaters to see it. And he does this very convincing intro where he's like, so many people worked hard on this. Everybody's blood, sweat, and tears went into it. We had all these great people. We had the best of the best, he called them. Now, you kind of get a sense going into a movie like Snake Eyes. Obviously, this is him selling the movie, and it's getting into his perspective, having been on the set and seeing all the wheels turning and all that stuff. And it's like, yeah, having gone through that whole process, that's probably how you might see this movie. But I feel like we as audience members know by now that you can put all the work known to man in a movie, especially an action movie, and it can still be underwhelming. I don't hate this movie or anything. I don't even think it's it's not even poorly made or poorly executed as far as its whole thing. I heard a little something last night about people complaining about the editing of the action scenes and stuff like that. I was expecting much worse as far as the editing. There are significantly worse edited action movies than this. There are a lot of movies that make this movie look like it's shot like a John Wick movie or like a Raid movie almost. Mind you, not even close to those is it. Like I said, there are significantly more worse made movies than this, I assure you. So going in, we get, like I said, going in not really knowing what to expect out of a story. We get what appears to be 3 different setups. Because we have the opening scene where we see him as a child and his father is murdered, of course, and they have the villain, this particular villain in this case, that's it's a character we barely see in the movie, and lacks significance for a lot of it. Comes in and has his father roll dice, and he says, if you win, you live; if you lose, you die. I don't know what the game is exactly, but I don't know what you would roll to win. But apparently, if you roll Snake Eyes, you're going to die, and that's what happens to his father, and that's apparently where his name originated. So, if that's like I said, if this just is like a standalone movie, if it wasn't a part of the whole, G.I. Joe thing, and it's a character that people already know, and this was just one standalone movie that wasn't going to be like a franchise or anything like that, this would be a decent background for a character named Snake Eyes. But knowing that it's a character, like I said, I don't really know that much about, but know that he has branched off into multiple mediums and has a certain following, I got the sense that it might be seen as a bit of an underwhelming origin, which is funny given the fact that the whole point of the movie is to be his origin. So, I can get a sense where this might quickly be seen as a letdown to people who might, unlike me, have gone in with expectations, any at all. But then once we set up that whole thing where it's like, oh, now he has a father he can avenge, and we have a villain, we have the face of a villain here. There's the second thing where we get him, of course, he's fighting in cages, because that's just what everybody does now in an origin story. And after one of these, he gets hired to do a certain thing, and this guy promises, hey, if you come and work for me, maybe I can just give you this dude, and it's the dude that killed his father. So we're kind of tying things together, but we're also kind of heading in two different directions as well. Then there is the third thing, where he has to turn on the guy that is that has hired him and offered to help him find his dad's killer, and he goes into the whole training thing. And of course, if you've seen one training sequence, you've seen all of them, and this one has quite a few training sequences. The only difference is that these have Rama from the raid, which I just mentioned, which is really promising. And it's like, hopefully to God, we can actually watch him fight again, since Mile 22 was not going to give us that. And yeah, that's one right there. Like, if you think this movie has poorly edited action scenes, you have not seen Mile 22. So that's just one example. Uh, so, continuing on that, yeah, so he goes into the whole training thing, and this is where it was like, okay, it seems like there's an awful lot happening here. But then I was kind of starting to get into it when it's like these things started crossing paths, when it turns out that he's going to have to basically play both sides without the other one knowing. Where there's the guy that initially hired him, and there is the people that he's with now, the clan, and these two things are going after the same thing, and they're against each other. And both of these sides want to use him. But the thing looming over his head is, well, first and foremost, got to avenge the father killing. Like, that's kind of the main priority. Not everybody in this story is going to understand that and know where I'm coming from, but that's number one, is killing that dude. So he's going to do whatever it takes to get to that portion of the story and stay on it. Even if the movie does not feel the same way, that's, I think, where the character's mind is at. So, there's that. And so there's a lot of fight scenes that just kind of come and go for various reasons, and they're fine. Like I said, I don't know if it's because it's been so long since I've seen an action movie in a theater. That could be it. I know there was Fast 9, but I already said how I felt about that. So, when you look at this, there are cases where some of them aren't, like, there are cases where we kind of are back a little ways and we can see him fighting multiple people just kind of in one shot without it cutting around everywhere. But there are also cases of it cutting around everywhere. Like I said, not near as bad as some movies that are out there. But there are cases where it's a little hard to tell what's happening. One of the things I kept trying to look at was to see it. A lot of these I was trying to figure out if Golding was like doing his own stunts and actually doing the fighting and all that. And it's like every time I felt like I was just about to get a good look at his face, it would like cut away, which usually means stunt double for sure. Like I said, there was so much cutting, I really wasn't quite sure. That could absolutely have been him. But you wouldn't know. So, like, there's one shot where he does some sort of, fighting thing or whatever, and then he, like, rolls over and it's definitely him. There could have very easily been a sneaky cut in there or not. I don't know. But it's always fun when you can actually see the actor's face when everybody's fighting, and this isn't really one of those cases very often. So... but as far as Golding as the lead, it is very interesting. He's been rising pretty much since Crazy Rich Asians, but it's like I'm still not quite sure he's fully getting the credit he deserves for how... Because Crazy Rich Asians was only 2018, that's only a few years ago. And from that point to now, he's had a very eclectic filmography. Where he's done, like, comedy, he's done thriller, he's done romance. I really dug him in The Gentleman, and now we've got him doing the action star thing. And he's a very appealing presence, and he's definitely got, like, a charm about him. And I do think he can carry a movie like this. Like anything that makes it seem like he wasn't able to carry this movie, I put more on the movie than I would him. Because I feel like he can definitely carry a movie, for sure. But it's... like I said, especially if you were to be able to, maybe see what he's doing a bit more in regards to these action scenes and just how much is being put into them. But like I said, with movies like this, they're not as keen on showing it as well as something like John Wick or The Raid or whatever. But it's I didn't think it was the action scenes aren't terrible. There's maybe one or two that are noticeably over edited, but there's others that kind of aren't. And I know this is like I know we're really setting the bar low as far as how we're complimenting these scenes. But yeah, like I said, if you've seen the worst of the worst, this execution isn't terrible. And like I said, even if there are the whole idea of you've seen one training scene, you've seen all of them. There's still something like the whole thing where he has to like balance the water when they're doing their whole thing. There's something there that draws you in and doesn't feel too overbearing where it's like, the camera has to be shaking constantly and stuff like that. Like I said, all these things are in there to an extent. But it's I don't think it's as near as sloppy as you could be led to believe going into it if you were to listen to it described in a way. But it's there. It's an action movie, and it does that, I guess. Um, there are cases where there are things that are a bit on the nose, like the inclusion of giant snakes. There's like three of them or something. It felt like the end of the Chamber of Secrets or something. Um, and there's stuff that's gonna ultimately be like the whole plot thread of avenging his dad. It comes to an extremely unsatisfying conclusion, but there's also the whole thing of you can tell they're trying to set up a franchise thing. It's like, is that the kind of thing that would come back? Were they leaving it open on purpose? Even though that's a dangerous thing to do, because people bitch and moan about franchises all the time, but when you see all the failed ones, you realize just how hard they really are to get off the ground. So, and I don't know if they're gonna be unless they just really force it, kind of like they did this one. It's I can't foresee this being some big branching off sort of thing that they kind of seem to want it to be. But it's yeah, I mean, like I said, if you look at it as a standalone movie, it might be fine, but you're gonna completely forget everything. Like I was trying to think if there was a specific action scene that stood out, because that's usually what it's like. Usually there's at least some big centerpiece or something, maybe a climax if you're not worn out by them, which you usually probably are. Especially in like these non-stop action movies. But there's not really one that comes to mind. Like there's maybe like one particular moment that might stand out, but as far as the action scenes themselves, nothing really stands out in a big way. There's no big centerpiece or anything like that, where like the whole scene is something you would kind of go back to just to watch by itself. Nothing really like that. And they try every now and then to spice it up. Like I'm always gonna be a sucker for like shots of a city at night and shit like that, or the way the subtitles kind of pop, like the way they like the font and the color and the way they're placed on the screen. Kind of added just a little bit of something. Like sometimes it's just those little details that make it just feel just a little more fresh than it would have, especially since the subtitles are minimal anyway. But yeah. But then there's other characters that come in that you can tell are like sort of franchise bait, and it's like, oh, these people they're here barely at all now, but they would be much more important later if we ever get to that point, even though we probably won't. One of which is Samara Weaving, and I feel like I've gone through this quite a few times already. Samara Weaving, who I have crowned the queen of cringe. I know everybody's fucking in love with her for some reason. I don't get it at all. Like, every time she walks onto a screen, I just want to fold up inside myself with embarrassment for her because I just don't think she's got it. But like Ready or Not, or The Babysitter, or God for fucking Big Guns Akimbo, everything she does to me has not worked yet. It just comes off really cringy and try hard to me, but it's won a lot of people over, so I'm very aware I'm in the minority on that. I don't get the Samara Weaving thing and don't think I will anytime soon, especially based on this. Even with the minimal time she's here, I got the same charmingly offhand, funny, in big ass quotes, funny delivery that she supposedly has that everybody loves. I don't fucking get the Samara Weaving thing, but to each their own, I guess. Good for her that she clearly has a fan base. And that's about all there is to take away from this. I think obviously they do the sequel bait, and there's something like they really wanted to get it in there, especially like it's almost like they were afraid that people weren't going to see their sequel bait, because usually you get like the mid-credit scene or the complete post-credit scene after all the credits have gone by. No, we get like 2 or 3 of the end credits, and then we get our little bonus scene that's like, hey, this is where the sequel would go if it happens. With the if feeling kind of big. I have no idea how this is going to do box office wise, but I guess we'll see. So, yeah. Or if people are even clamoring for it. I don't, because like I said, I don't know if people remember the last 2 movies hardly existing at all. Like when they actually name drop Joe in this movie, it took me forever to remember who played him. And it's like, that was Bruce Willis, right? I think. I still say that with uncertainty. That's how unmemorable Retaliation is. So, yeah. Okay. So, let's go into our last movie, which is the indie movie of this group, I guess. Which is How It Ends. Which is by, Zoe Lister-Jones, who did, that Craft sequel that nobody wanted and nobody liked last year. It's her and her husband, I believe. And this is one of those quirky comedies about the end of the world. And it's kind of weird how that's almost becoming its own sort of subgenre, but here it is again. And there's a lot... mainly, it feels like Seeking a Friend for the End of the World. It feels a lot like that. Especially with its approach of the interactions with the other characters and how the other characters are dealing with it seemingly nonchalantly. The fact that there's a giant meteor that's coming to Earth, and this is the very last day before it's going to hit and kill everybody. And so just kind of seeing where everybody's at now. So it's basically her, and who we learn very nonchalantly later is a sort of like projection that she sees of her younger self that's like her conscience. But because everybody's kind of on the same level now that the world is ending, everybody can see this younger self of her now. So her and her younger self get most of the back and forth dialogue in this as they sort of walk around town, running into cameos for an hour and 20 minutes, and that's what the whole movie is. And there's a lot of... most of them will be people that you know. And you would think with all the people that you see here, this would be some sort of worthwhile endeavor, this movie. But it's really kind of not. There's a whole lot of people here that we know are capable of a whole lot of things, and they're pretty much given nothing to do, and then the characters move on to the next person. I don't know how much of this is written and how much of it is improvised, because a lot of it feels like terrible improvisation that didn't go anywhere. Where they just kind of turned the camera on and they said, you're a famous person, you're only going to be in this for 3 minutes, just do whatever. I'm sure you can work it out. And then just kind of nothing happened for a lot of them. Like, if this is written, that's a bummer for them. So, but yeah, so we start off and we're immediately doing, like, there's, just in the editing alone, at the very start, you're bombarded with this, look how quirky and indie thing we are. You would think we'd be long past that shit by now. You would think that would be, the whole quirky indie thing would be such a cliche at this point. Because isn't the whole point of the indie scene to subvert cliches and go in different directions than like mainstream movies have? or things that maybe didn't start mainstream but certainly got mainstream. Um, yeah, you would think the overly quirky indie movie phase would have long since been dead by now. And like any other time it would be used, it would be in sort of a self-aware way. But it doesn't really feel like there's much of anything self-aware about this. This movie thinks it's really charming, I think, in the way it's so offbeat about itself. But yeah, that's what I just said is basically what the movie is. They just run into cameos for an hour and 20. It's very short, an hour and 23 minutes, I think it is. Um, and they just walk around and are really nonchalant about the fact that they're gonna die. That's the joke. Like that is the joke of the movie, and we're gonna get it for an hour and 20 minutes. And every now and then there's a decent shot. Like when I feel like it's really like I was talking about the way they reveal things is really nonchalant. Like the way they reveal the fact that this younger character that's always with her is her younger self inside of her mind, but now she's visible to everybody because of circumstances. I feel like unless I miss something, they talk about it being the end of the world and that this is the last day. But unless I miss something, it's really, really late and just really offhand that they mention it's a meteor. And then right after that scene, we actually get a shot of the two of them just sort of walking down the street having a normal conversation. And you can just see the meteor in the background, like on its way. Even though it's still hours away, it's obviously that's means it's very visible. So stuff like that is interesting, but that's like one shot. Like that. So I mean, if you're interested in any of these people are gonna like this is the kind of thing normally I'd say, oh, see it for yourself, but this isn't that kind of talking about the movie. So like I said, if any of these people, these are most of the people that pop up. There's Glenn Howerton, who keeps running around, and he is ambiguously threatening. A real stretch for Glenn Howerton of all people. Fred Armisen, who is another person, an unseen person's younger self, like her projection of what's in her mind. And Logan Marshall Green, interestingly cast as this guy who like walks around with his dog, that our main character has a thing for and hopes to ask out at this party as her last act on Earth, basically. Her parents, her estranged parents, were Bradley Whitford and Helen Hunt, who were kind of on opposite sides of the movie. We get Helen Hunt closer to the end and Whitford closer to the beginning. Said more stuff that kind of sounds like really bad improv from extremely talented people that we know are amazing. They were just kind of given this shit script, I guess. Whitney Cummings, who is throwing this party that she's going to try to go to. Nick Kroll is there as a stoner who's just there. Finn Wolfhard, who we only see on a phone screen really briefly. Olivia Wilde as a friend that she's trying to make amends with. Mr. and Mrs. Charlie Day, probably because Glenn Howerton's here. Just, and speaking of people that are connected to people, there's probably the only scene that I found somewhat amusing, which was the bickering neighbors played by Paul Scheer and Rob Hubel. And Rob Hubel is basically like this anti-science scientist, which is something that sounds weirdly absurd, but now that we see the way some things go, maybe not all that unrealistic. Like he not only does he think that the moon landing was fake, but he thinks like NASA in general is fake, and he says like, you know, who would make up a stupid name like NASA? That's probably the closest to a funny bit that we get in this. But that's just the appeal of Scheer and Hubel together, I would think. That's the scene where I feel like we learn that it's a meteor for the first time. And like I said, it's really fucking late in the movie. So there's that. Colin Hanks is in there, and I'm sure there's more that I'm not even thinking of. But that's what the movie is running into these people for like a few minutes at a time. And I guess they're supposed to add some sort of spark to the movie when they come in. Like, each individual character is supposed to be this really big, memorable moment. And it's just not there. Like, for hardly any of them. Regardless of the talent we have, it's just not there. And to my understanding, this was shot like last summer, so it was like maybe it was trying to be a bit feel a bit weirdly real as far as like all the streets are empty and like everybody's preparing for the absolute worst and all that. Or it almost kind of felt apocalyptic. So like maybe if this had come out last summer instead of being shot last summer, it would have a different feel and be a bit more interesting and weirdly appealing. But it's yeah, and it's as far as having like its serious moments, because it obviously it's ultimately headed in one direction, but it's like how do they handle that while still trying to be this comedy or whatever, and the way the whole idea of her having her younger self there physically, where it does eventually get to this point where it turns into this whole thing about like it does go through the whole same old hoops of the real meaning of living and shit like that you're gonna see in most of these. And it's all the shit you've heard before. Like there's nothing new to be said about that, and certainly this movie's not gonna find it if there is. But the way it goes into this whole thing with her younger self and how they interact and how it turns into this thing about basically being able to love yourself when it seems like that's a really hard thing to do when you're like at that much of a low point, and kind of finding that place again. That's where it almost finds something. Like like the whole thing is the movie, and the fact that she's like the writer and director makes it even kind of funnier. That the whole concept is her looking for herself, and it's like it feels like the movie is looking for itself and almost gets there, but then there's always something that just makes you say, I don't give a fuck. Because even when it gets to the last shot, like the very last shot, which we know what that last shot is probably going to be to an extent. Like in vague details, we know what the last shot is probably going to be. And for some inexplicable reason, with one inexplicable touch, it's almost like they couldn't resist. They couldn't resist their little quirky indie thing. They had to do this shot. They couldn't even do without trying to say, "Oh, look how quirky we are." It's ridiculous. So I honestly I felt like I was always on the verge of being into this, but then once it ended, and I kind of really thought about it again, I started to feel like I wasn't even close to like grasping onto something. Like I said, when it tries to get super serious about itself briefly towards the end there, when it's her dealing with herself and how she sees herself, there was almost something there. It was really, really close. I was really, really close to feeling something. But it never came. And all these people, you can drag all these people into it that you want, who obviously had nothing else to do because it was shot last summer when nothing was going on. I feel like that's the only way you could assemble all the people this movie assembles. And this is all that it is. It feels like such a waste of everything, whether it be concept, or actors, or time, or it's funny. The whole thing about we were talking about with Old, where it's like the whole idea of being afraid of time and knowing that like death is inevitable and stuff like that, and it's like it's funny how this movie also kind of brings those thoughts to mind, but yet the movie itself is such a waste of time, and it's like that's an hour and 20 minutes I could have spent living in the way this movie seems to desperately want me to, but instead I was watching this bullshit, and that seems to completely contradict its own message. So, good job on that, quality-wise. So, yeah, so I think I'm going to go ahead and finish this particular video up with that. I'm going to do another one right after this for the Tomorrow War and Infinite, and then we will go from there. I do really want to talk about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's book that I just finished, so that'll be its own video as well. Probably after the ones I just mentioned, if I had to guess, because I really want to talk about this. And then some other stuff that I missed, and me and my brother talked about Loki, a whole bunch of stuff. Jungle Cruise is finally here, and then we'll go from there. Then we'll be in August, and things should start getting crazy from then on. So until then, I think that's going to be it for this.